All right, yesterday we had the elections in the state of Brandenburg. This was the third and final East German state election that was held this year, and the results were definitely interesting. And in this video, I want to take a look at the overall results and also some of the demographics, the way the vote went, the way the electoral map went down with the different districts. This is going to be kind of a deep dive into the results for the Brandenburg state election, and it's going to be similar to the videos I did on Saxony and Thuringia. So first, I want to give a breakdown of the raw results as they are. These are finalized and these are complete. This is what they are. And so we have an interesting result. Despite most of the polls saying that the AFD was going to come first place by a small margin, the SPD ended up winning this election. Now, the SPD is the party of the incumbent governor, Dietmar Woidke, and it was likely due to the fact of his personal popularity and support from other parties to prevent the AFD from winning that allowed the SPD to win this election in the end. So the SPD won 30.9%, up 4.7 points from the last election. The AFD came a strong second with 29.2% and won 5.7 points, up from what they got in 2019. So they didn't win, but they did increase significantly and also overperform the polls. Now, what's interesting is the AFD was expected to win with around 27-28%. So they got 29% and came second, which means the AFD did better than expected, but the SPD did a lot better than expected. The BSV got 13.5%, interestingly enough, beating the CDU, which came in fourth place with only 12.1%. The CDU was expected to come third, and this was actually the worst result of the CDU in this state. They are not in the federal government, and they, in most states, are seeing a rise in popularity because of the backlash against the SPD. However, in this state, that was kind of different to what we saw in a state like Thuringia, for example. And so the CDU suffered some losses here. And even though 12.1% isn't dramatic, it is dramatic as, for example, 6% for the SPD was in Thuringia or Saxony, it is their worst result, and it is a loss at a time where in other states they are growing. Now, the Greens won 4.1%, a drop of 6.7 points, and Die Linke won 3%, a drop of 7.7. Now, both the Greens and Die Linke have lost all the representation in the Landtag. They are below the 5% threshold, and they did not win any seats. So that was, I believe, 10 seats for each party. So they are not represented. And for the Greens, this is interesting, but for Die Linke, this is very significant because this is the first East German state where Die Linke is no longer present in the state legislature, and that is historic because Die Linke is, of course, the successor to the reformed East German Communist Party. They were a party that for decades was stronger in the East than in the West, and so this is one of their heartland states. And in fact, Brandenburg is one of the states that was historically the strongest for Die Linke, and for them to fall below 5%, winning only 3%, and losing all their seats for the first time is a huge historical development for the party in this state, and also a signal to troubles to come in the future. The Free Voters won 2.6%. They were able to enter in with a direct mandate in the last election. However, this will not be the case, and they will lose all their seats as well. So we have four parties, and we can take a look here. The SPD is the largest of the four with 32 seats, followed by the AFD at 30, followed by the BSV with 14, and the CDU with 12. Now, interestingly, the AFD has won 30 seats, which is enough for them to have the so-called Sperrminorität, which means that they have the ability to block constitutional reforms because, of course, a two-thirds majority is required on some laws. So if the government, with support of another party, they would need a voter from the AFD. So if the AFD group itself votes together against something, they can block certain reforms and certain laws from being passed by the state legislature, which does give them a bit more leverage than they have had in the past. So the AFD, even though they're not the largest, even though they're not going to be in government, they have significantly strengthened their opposition, their role in the opposition, not only through sheer numbers, but also reaching that critical 30 seat, which is the equivalent of around 33.34 of the seats in the legislature. Now, if we take a look at the map, we can see, similar to 2019, the eastern Brandenburg went heavily for the AFD. Cities such as Frankfurt Oder, Eisenhüttenstadt, and Cottbus, and the rural surrounding areas in the east went heavily for the AFD. Parts around Potsdam and in the west of the state, which have historically voted for the SPD, remained there pretty constant. Now, if we take a look at some of the direct mandates, Hans-Christoph Brandt, the AFD leader, the AFD lead candidate, won his direct mandate. And interestingly enough, in another district, Dietmar Woidke lost his direct mandates to Stefan Kubicki by only around 7 votes. So it was a very close race. And of course, Dietmar Woidke will still be in the Landtag, but that is somewhat of a personal defeat for him. So we can see that it is a close race between the SPD and the AFD. And a lot of these districts is very, very neck and neck. And we see how polarized this state has become as in regard, in contrast to other states where there's a maybe 3 or 4 way race. Now, if we take a look at the movement of voters, we can see that the SPD was saved by left wing and also centrist voters from other parties. 47,000 from the Greens, 25,000 from Die Linke, some non-voters. So a big point of this election was the race between the AFD and the SPD. And a lot of people did vote for the SPD to kind of prevent the AFD from coming to power, and that seemed to work. But of course, it has eaten into the results for the Greens and Die Linke, which has pushed them further below 5%. They were expected to fall below, but they ended up falling even further than the polls were showing. But the SPD did end up losing some voters to the AFD and to the BSV, which is understandable. Now the AFD lost some to the BSV, which they share some positions on, but of course, as usual, the AFD won among non-voters and pretty much across the board with primarily CDU and SPD voters. The CDU itself won some non-voters over, but we see here they lost to all three of the other parties in the state legislature. The Greens, interestingly, here we see suffering losses to the other parties only by a few thousand, but a lot of their voters going to the SPD. And so the SPD did benefit from this, but of course the Greens were a coalition partner. The Greens are kind of an ally, a natural ally of the SPD, and them falling below 5% is a kind of defeat for this party, and it is a way where this strategy kind of backfires because the Greens support the SPD to prevent the AFD from winning, which is one of their goals. However, if they do it too much, then it risks pushing these parties below 5%, and that is the case in a lot of these East German elections where there's a two-way race. Now, Die Linke, of course, as in other states, most of their voters went to the BSV, which split away from the party. That is pretty understandable, and then, of course, some to the SPD. If we look at the free voters were able to win in this state, around 5%. They also had a candidate with a direct mandate who lost his seat, and they kind of became somewhat less relevant in this election, less of a focus, and so they pretty much lost across the board. The BSV, being new party, mobilized non-voters similar to the AFD. They have that kind of populist anti-establishment message, and so they were able to mobilize voters who have not voted before, and of course Die Linke, which they split away from, but also some voters from the other parties as well. Now, if we take a look at the different demographics, I want to take a look at the different working groups. So first I'm going to take a look at the self-employed. Now, if we take a look at the self-employed, we see that they went heavily, not heavily, but around 10 points for the AFD. So 34% AFD, 24% SPD. These are going to be business owners. These are going to be upper middle class people. And so the AFD won this demographic, but also the CDU performed very well here, which is understandable. The CDU does very well amongst middle class voters. It has kind of the free market economic that is favorable to a lot of small and big businesses. And now if we take a look at the employed, we see that the SPD won slightly ahead of the AFD, but here it was actually pretty average to what the results were. Across all of the groups. So employed is pretty much close to the average. And then we see, similar to other states, a divide between blue collar and retirees. Now, if you look at blue collar, the AFD won this group by around 20 points. So the AFD won 46% of the blue collar vote. The SPD won 24. So the AFD was clearly ahead amongst blue collar workers, and of course, blue collar middle-aged men who are blue collar workers is even more in favor of the AFD. So this is their very strong demographic. And this was the reason that the AFD was so strong. And on the other hand, the SPD drew their strength from older voters, from retirees, and this is of course the retiree bracket. The AFD still did well here. They still did around over 20%, second place. However, we see there's an 18-point gap, and so a strong SPD support amongst retirees, strong AFD support amongst blue collar voters, that kind of averages out, and the SPD has the employed and unemployed, or the employed and the self-employed kind of go pretty even, not too drastic as it is for some of the other groups. Now, last I want to take a look at the different age brackets. Now, the SPD gained across the board, which is pretty understandable. Their strongest group is, of course, the 70 and older. That is the case for the SPD and the CDU. In a lot of states, they are the traditional parties. They are the two main parties, and so a lot of people in their 70s have been voting for them for maybe 50 years and are used to voting for these parties, so they still perform very well. But they did win amongst the youth. A lot of the maybe green voters went to this party, but this was, of course, a lot of this had to do with the fact that Dietmar Woidke himself was a popular politician, and other parties were supporting the SPD rather than the party itself, seeing a resurgence here. Now, the AFD did very well amongst all the demographics. They increased the most amongst the youth, but they won the most amongst the 35 to 44-year-olds. So this is a similar breakdown to what we have seen in the past, where the AFD does, decent amongst the youth, very good amongst middle age, and then they kind of drop off and fall off amongst the older voters. And so we see here similar. They gained across the board, but we see a plus 13 points in the 16 to 24-year-olds. So a huge increase amongst the youth, and they won the youth vote in this election, and then won some across the board, down as you get older. The CDU held pretty steady amongst the youth, but they did lose some of their older voters. Some of these people likely went to the SPD, and of course these losses added up to a 4-point loss for the CDU. Now the Greens lost heavily amongst the youth. They were the largest party amongst the youth in 2019. They dropped 21 points, so falling from around 27 to only 6, a huge drop. And this is similar to what we saw for the Greens in both the European elections and the elections in Saxony and in Thuringia, so nothing too different here. And most of the demographic breakdown and most of the age groups, all of these variables are pretty much similar to Saxony and Thuringia. There's not too much of a difference here. There's just maybe kind of a few numbers here and there based off of the fact that Brandenburg is a different state. Brandenburg has a stronger SPD, but if we look at the proportions based on age or different working groups, it's not too different from other states we've seen. Now, Die Linke here, interestingly enough, they have a lot of voters amongst the youth and amongst the elderly, the 70 and older. And this is because there is a appeal to the progressive student, the student youth in universities. They're very kind of left-wing revolutionary protest movement. And a lot of these people support Die Linke. And then, of course, there's a lot of older voters that are maybe nostalgic for the East German past and have voted for Die Linke for a long time. And so we see, they're very strong amongst the very old and the very young, but they did suffer losses across the board. And even amongst the older voters, they dropped 11 points significantly. So, as we will see, I assume most of those voters did end up going to the BSV. The Free Voters lost, across the board, not anything too significant. Now, the BSV here is kind of the opposite of, it's similar to Die Linke. They have strong, decent support amongst the youth in the Middle Ages, and then they've taken a lot of older voters away from Die Linke. A lot of people that have historically voted the party maybe are more socially conservative or traditional, but also left-wing and socialist, and support the BSV over Die Linke. And so here we see the breakdown. Nothing too major in terms of the shifts in age, but we have that. And then we take a look here. This is the graph where you have the 16 to 24-year-olds for each party, and we can see here how big the AFD's victory was. So 31% against 19 from the SPD. So amongst the youngest age group, the AFD won by 12 points, a significant victory for them. And then we have even the BSV actually performing very well here with 13%. And then parties like the Greens and Die Linke did, of course, got above 5% here, where they did not on the average. And then we take a look at the 70 and older. Here we can see the complete opposite. The SPD is at 49, almost 50% alone, and the other parties kind of trailing them with the AFD in second, and then the BSV and the CDU. Now, the last thing I want to look at is the graph that shows the way the state has voted historically, because this is very significant. Now, Brandenburg has voted for the SPD in a state election, the Landtagswahl, in every election since 1990. It's gone to the CDU in federal elections for the Bundestagswahl or for the European elections, but for these type of elections, for the elections for a state legislature and the governor indirectly, it has always gone for the SPD. But nonetheless, we can see a drastic change. In some of the other states, in the past, it was pretty much a clear three-way split between the CDU, the SPD, and the PDS or Die Linke. And now we see a very different picture. We see new parties popping up, the Greens, the Free Voters, not being too large, but kind of coming in and adding a few seats here and there. But we see also a steady growth of the AFD. Now, the AFD has significantly increased their vote, even though they did not win first place. They've gone from around 12% in 2014 to 23% in 2019 to 29, almost 30% in 2024. So a steady growth, and we see the party has kind of replaced both the CDU and Die Linke as being the main challenger, main competitor to the SPD. Now, the last time we had an election this close was in 2004, where Dagmar Enkelmann, the candidate of the PDS, was kind of vying for the minister-president, the governor position, and in the polls, some of the polls had the PDS beating the SPD, but in the end, the SPD won by around 3 or 4 points. It was around 31% for the SPD against 28% for the PDS, Die Linke. And so 2004 was the closest until now. This was even closer. The AFD has won more votes than any other party outside of the SPD in this state. So they have been the biggest challenger to the SPD with this election. But we can also see that the CDU, similar to the SPD in states where the CDU is the strongest. So in Saxony, where the CDU is very strong, the SPD has collapsed completely. And in this state where the SPD is strong, the CDU has completely collapsed. So we see a polarization on one side, the AFD against whatever party has hit a solidified position. So in this state, it's SPD against AFD, and the CDU has collapsed. In other states, it's CDU against AFD, and the SPD has collapsed. And the CDU is still, important here in terms of forming governments and things like that. However, we see, they're much smaller than they were in the past, and they are now the fourth largest party behind the other three. But the SPD, despite the unpopularity of the federal government, they have managed to maintain a strong position in this state, and we will have to see how it goes in the future. But this is the way the state has gone, and as you can see, a clear trend. Now, Die Linke has dropped out. As I said, they have a steady decline since 2004, losing in every election. Now, you can argue that the BSV is effectively a replacement for Die Linke, that Die Linke is not really gone, but they've been replaced because the BSV does have similar positions, and almost all their politicians are from Die Linke, not all, but a lot of them. So you could say that the BSV has replaced Die Linke as a political force on the left, further left in the SPD. But in terms of Die Linke officially, Die Linke as a party, they are out. And this is the first state this has happened. And this is a state where they were, in 2004 around 28%, and now they're at 3%. So that is definitely significant because they were once a major player in this state, and we see that those two parties have been reduced, and there's been a change from purple and red to now red and blue. So that's going to be it for this video. I want to give you guys kind of an overview of the results and the demographics like I did on the other videos. And of course, that will be it for these elections. I might do some more videos contrasting all of them together as a whole, or looking at the way East Germany has voted historically with this new data, and I will do that in the next weeks and months to come. But of course, we also have the Austrian elections next week, and I will make sure to cover those. And then we will have kind of a period of no elections, and then we will have the federal elections sometime next year. It's not clear. Obviously, the federal elections will not be called. This result was not a disaster for the SPD. This was a victory for the SPD. So there is not going to be the SPD is not going to bring down the federal government. However, there is a small chance, that the FDP, off of their performance, which was less than 1%, could maybe hold talks to pull out of the coalition. So we could see early elections. It's not guaranteed. I would still say it's most likely going to happen in September 2025, but there is a chance we could see elections maybe early, this winter. But if we do, I will definitely cover those. So if you do like these videos, please do like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you for watching.